Welcome! Today, we're totally rethinking everything you thought you knew about wealth, power, and materialism.
Seriously, look around. Do you actually own your stuff, or is it secretly controlling you? Our intense obsession with owning things is exactly what traps us in endless anxiety and conflict.
But the Islamic concept of El-Mâlik, the absolute owner, completely shatters this illusion for us.
Look at this Arabic root. It fascinatingly links property and possessions directly to strength and force.
This brilliantly shows the huge difference between just hoarding physical objects and holding true, ultimate authority. Think about it. How can we claim we own a house when we didn't create the earth?
The reality? Your wealth is just a temporary trust, an emanet. It's not absolute property.
Believing we absolutely own the world? That's exactly what fuels destructive greed and massive global inequality.
The result is artificial scarcity. Food literally rots in one wealthy nation, while neighboring countries starve.
The absolute ownership mindset creates fearful hoarders, while the trust mindset creates generous, open-handed givers.
Embracing this trust mindset brings immense psychological relief. It's your key to true spiritual liberation.
The poet Rumi perfectly captured this delicate balance with this stunning metaphor about a boat.
Let wealth carry you forward, but never, ever let it into your heart to sink you.
So how do we apply this? Earn lawfully, share generously, and master wealth before it masters you.
You're truly free when gaining the whole world and losing it feel exactly the same. I'll leave you with this. If you lost everything tomorrow, what would truly still belong to you?
Welcome to this explainer on El-Mâlik and the illusion of ownership. Let's get right into it. So why has humanity constantly fought over wealth and power since the dawn of time? Well, we suffer because we think we actually own the things. We're just borrowing. To get this, look at the Arabic root M-L-K. It literally means absolute strength and power. It's wild. Words for property, angels, and even perfection all share this exact same powerful root. Which brings us to El-Mâlik, the divine name meaning the one true absolute sovereign. Human ownership is an illusion. When you give something away, it leaves your hands entirely. This sparks a huge paradigm shift. It's mulkiyat, absolute ownership, versus emanet, meaning a divine trust. Claiming absolute ownership historically leads straight to rigid ideologies, brutal wars, and total tyranny. But viewing wealth as a trust fosters sharing, serious responsibility, and genuine spiritual freedom. Now, this illusion of ownership breeds three specific, pretty toxic archetypes of human arrogance. Check this out. These historical figures map perfectly to their fatal words: I, mine, and by my power. Satan's downfall, saying I am better, claiming ultimate ownership over his own perceived superiority. Then there's Pharaoh. He claimed Egypt was his, turning political power into corrupt, absolute possession. And Qarun thought his immense wealth came purely from his own intellect, totally forgetting the source. Here's the crucial takeaway. When you treat a divine trust like a possession, it actually enslaves you. Rumi hit the nail on the head. Wealth is the sea and your heart is the ship. If that water, the blinding love of wealth, enters your ship, you're gonna sink. Look at Abdurrahman ibn Auf. He gained massive wealth but gave it away freely, completely unattached. So this brings us to a really pivotal question. What exactly is true freedom? Well, it for sure doesn't mean you have to embrace poverty or own absolutely nothing. You're truly free when gaining wealth and losing wealth feel exactly the same to you. Realizing we're just temporary trustees is literally the ultimate cure for our endless worldly conflicts. To wrap up this explainer, I leave you with this. Are you the master of your wealth or its slave?
You know, it's crazy how obsessed we are with ownership today. We literally define ourselves by what we have, right? The house, the car, the bank account. But what if the very concept of absolute ownership is actually just a massive illusion? What if all that anxiety, that greed tearing the modern world apart, comes from a total misunderstanding of who actually owns what? Well, let's dive into this explainer. Today we're going to tackle the modern problem of material greed, but we're going to do it using some really profound, ancient linguistic and theological solutions drawn directly from the Arabic language and Islamic theology.
Okay, here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the root of power, compare Malik versus Melik, and unpack the illusion of ownership.
After that, we'll hit the 3 symbols of arrogance, look at wealth as a trust, and wrap up with attaining true freedom.
Section 1. The Root of Power, focusing on Arabic linguistics. The Arabic language is honestly like a giant mathematical puzzle. It's absolutely fascinating. Words are built on base root letters. So here we have M, L, and K. Now from just these 3 letters, you can spin off a whole bunch of different words. And what's the thread that ties them all together? It's the core idea of strength, power, and really forceful intensity. So whether you're talking about a piece of property, a state, a king, or actually even angels, which in Arabic comes from a derivation meaning a strong entity holding things up, the absolute DNA of all these words is power.
Moving on to Section 2. Malik versus Melik. Action versus essence. Now this is where it gets incredibly cool. You see how the physical shape of these grammatical vowel marks perfectly mimics the philosophical state of the word? So at the top, the dame vowel creates the word mulk, meaning power. And visually, it sits up high, kind of like a really proud subject with its head held high. Then the fetha vowel gives us milk. This mark lies completely flat, which perfectly symbolizes an object that's submitted or lying down. And finally, you've got the kesra vowel, dropping right down below the word to create milk, which means property. It physically drops to the lowest point, entirely dependent, exactly the way property totally relies on having an owner. I mean, the grammar itself is literally teaching us philosophy.
And that brings us to this massive theological difference between Mâlik and Mâlik. So Mâlik is all about action. It's the authority to give or take away property or power. But Mâlik is about essence. We're talking absolute sovereignty. Sure, a human being might temporarily be a Mâlik over, say, a plot of land, but only the divine is the Mâlik, ruling over both that land and the human who claims to own it. Absolute sovereignty? Yeah, that belongs solely to the divine.
Section 3. The illusion of ownership. Eminent versus Milkiyet.
Let's pivot for a second from theoretical linguistics to the real world, the harsh reality of human behavior. The crucial distinction here is eminent versus Milkiyet, because claiming absolute ownership, Milkiyet, is just a total myth. I mean, think about it for a second. If you say, I own this house, well, did you create the iron, the stone, the cement, the earth it's sitting on? No way. You didn't create those atoms. You're just borrowing them for a little while. The true reality of our relationship with our stuff is eminent. It's a trust. It's stewardship. We're really just temporary caretakers.
And we've seen this dynamic playing out literally since the dawn of human history. Just look at the ancient archetype of Cain and Abel, or Kabil and Habil in this context. Why did Kabil offer his worst harvest? Because he looked at it as his absolute property. He thought, this is mine. Why on earth should I give the best of it away? But Habil? He offered his absolute best, because he understood the harvest wasn't truly his. It belonged to the divine, and he was just a steward of it. When we view our possessions as mine, it just leads straight to conflict, greed, and holding back. But viewing them as a trust, that paves the way for true righteousness and generosity.
So I want you to ask yourself honestly, right now, do you own your wealth, or is your wealth owning you? Because when we start hoarding, when we get terrified of losing our status, or our newest gadgets, or our bank balances, we aren't the masters of our property anymore. We've actually become its prisoners.
Okay, Section 4. 3 symbols of arrogance. Satan, Pharaoh, and Karun.
These 3 historical archetypes map out the 3 toxic mantras that just absolutely destroy human empathy. First up is Satan, whose mantra was Ena, meaning I. Like, I am better than him. I am made of fire, he is made of clay. It's the ultimate arrogance of origin and superiority. Second is the Pharaoh. His mantra was Li, meaning for me. He looked out at his massive empire and said, is this not all for me? Total arrogance of absolute power. And finally, there's Karun, this figure of just immense wealth. His mantra was Indi, meaning by my own merit. He basically claimed his wealth was 100% due to his own genius, completely erasing the divine from the equation. So I, for me, and by my own merit. Those are the 3 historical pillars of toxic selfishness.
Moving to Section 5, Wealth as a Trust, the Practical Solution.
I knew he was Allah because he didn't give me everything I wanted. Wow, that is just so deeply reflective. Think about how many times we get angry because something we really desired didn't work out, or a financial gain completely fell through. But honestly, unanswered desires are often this profound protection. If we actually got every single piece of wealth and power we ever wished for, the sheer, crushing weight of that ego and responsibility would probably completely destroy us.
So what do we do with what we do have? The source material lays out these 5 highly practical steps, the 5 rights of wealth. Number 1, earn it lawfully, because halal or lawful wealth is loyal, while unlawfully gained wealth is a traitor that will eventually turn on you. 2, share it generously. Wealth is meant to circulate. Hoarding it literally causes societal decay. 3, be incredibly grateful when you gain, but just as importantly, give praise when you lose, realizing it was never yours to begin with. 4, look at every single asset you have purely as a temporary trust. And 5, own the wealth. Do not under any circumstances let the wealth own you.
And that takes us to our final section. Section 6, attaining true freedom.
Poverty isn't having nothing, it's allowing nothing to have you. This quote completely flips our modern ideas of rich and poor totally upside down. You could have millions of dollars sitting in the bank, but if you're constantly terrified of losing a single penny, you are emotionally impoverished. True wealth is actually emotional detachment. It's this fierce independence where your things serve you rather than you spending your life serving your things.
So, if we distill everything we've unpacked in this explainer today, when having absolutely all the power, the money, the success handed right to you, and then having it all completely stripped away in an instant,
Feel exactly, entirely the same. That equilibrium, that totally undisturbed peace of mind regardless of what material stuff you have or don't have, that is the ultimate freedom.
I'll leave you with this final thought. Take a real look around your life today. Look at all the things you claim to own. Are you truly the master of your possessions, or have you just become their most dedicated servant? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Until next time, keep questioning and keep learning.
You know, there is this very specific, very universal feeling you get when you finally sign the paperwork for something big.
Oh, absolutely. The dopamine rush.
Right. Like maybe it's a car, maybe it's a house, or even, I don't know, just unboxing a really expensive piece of tech you've been saving up for months to buy. You hold it in your hands or you look at those keys and your brain does this like little chemical dance.
Yeah, you tell yourself, this is mine.
Exactly. You say, this is mine. But almost immediately, like trailing right on the heels of that dopamine hit, there is a shatter, and it's anxiety.
It's the immediate fear of loss.
Yeah, you suddenly start worrying about a scratch on the bumper or, you know, the potential for a leaky roof or dropping that brand new phone on the pavement.
Right.
The very thing you just claimed absolute ownership of suddenly feels like it, well, like it owns a little piece of your peace of mind.
It is a fascinating psychological paradox, really, because the moment we claim absolute possession over a material object, we basically tether our emotional state to its physical fragility.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
We tie ourselves to it.
Exactly. We think we are acquiring power, but very often we are just, acquiring a new set of vulnerabilities. We bind ourselves to the physical decay of the world. And in doing so, we essentially hand over our autonomy to an inanimate object.
Okay, let's unpack this, because today's deep dive takes us into an ancient linguistic and, well, theological framework that completely flips this modern anxiety on its head.
It really does. It's a completely different paradigm.
It is. We are pulling from an in-depth, translated transcript of a lecture series by a thinker named Mustafa İslamoğlu. And the entire focus of this lecture is on one specific concept, which is El-Mâlik.
Right, which translates roughly to the absolute owner or the absolute king.
Yeah, it is one of the 99 names of God in Islamic theology. And I want to be super clear right up front. We are exploring this specific text impartially, looking at it as a profound philosophical and psychological lens.
Right, we're extracting the wisdom from the framework itself.
Exactly. Whether you come at this from a secular perspective, a religious one, or somewhere completely in between, the historical context and the insights here regarding human ego, power, and the frankly terrifying burden of what we think we own, they are razor sharp.
They are. And what's fascinating here is that the approach the source takes doesn't begin with, abstract mysticism. It begins with the physical architecture of language.
The literal grammar.
Yes. It treats the Arabic language almost as if it were a branch of physical science or mathematics. So the text zeroes in on the Arabic root of the word Malik, which is composed of 3 consonants, M, L, and K.
Okay, MLK.
Right. For context, Semitic languages operate on a system of triliteral roots. You have 3 base letters, and you derive vast webs of meaning by shifting them around or adding vowels.
It's kind of like a linguistic algorithm, you know? Like you plug in the variables and it generates a localized meaning based on a foundational code.
That is a great way to visualize it. So the source points out that with these 3 specific root letters, M, L, and K, you can mathematically create 6 possible combinations.
Just moving the letters around.
Right. You could have Meleke, Keleme, Kemele, Lekeme, Mekele, and Lamike. Out of those 6 mathematical permutations, 5 are actively used as actual words in the Arabic language today.
Okay.
But the critical insight here is that no matter how you shuffle those 3 letters, every single word that emerges from that specific MLK DNA shares a singular underlying core meaning.
And that meaning is?
They all trace back to the concept of raw strength, power, and, depending on the context, even violence and severity. Unyielding strength is the foundational material of all these words.
The examples the text gives to prove this are just wild to me.
They're very striking, yeah.
So the word lekme, which uses L, K, M, literally translates to a physical punch, like a boxer, someone who punches for a living, is called a mulakim.
Correct.
But then, using those exact same letters in a different order, you get the word kemal, which translates to perfection. Wait, really? The word for a physical punch and the word for spiritual perfection share the exact same etymological root.
They do. And the philosophy embedded in that connection completely challenges our baseline assumptions.
No, so?
Well, think about it. When we in the modern world think of perfection, especially spiritual or moral perfection, we tend to picture something entirely passive.
Right, like tranquility.
Exactly. We picture softness, a serene monk meditating on a mountain. But the linguistic root here argues something entirely different. It asserts that Kemal perfection is a state of a thing or a person reaching its ultimate, most powerful, indestructible form.
That reframes the concept entirely. I mean, think about a classic Roman arch.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Right, we look at an ancient stone arch and we see this beautiful, flawless, elegant architectural form. Looks peaceful.
Very serene.
But that arch only achieves its perfect stability because of unimaginably violent, opposing gravitational forces crushing those stones together.
Yes, the tension is immense.
It requires immense underlying physical strength to keep that structure from collapsing. So true perfection in that sense isn't soft at all. It requires a baseline of absolute unyielding power.
That architectural analogy captures the essence perfectly. And it bridges us directly to how the text defines El-Melik.
The absolute owner.
Right. If the root implies ultimate unyielding strength, then El-Mâlik is the absolute owner of power, is the entity whose strength is the foundation of reality itself. And the source introduces a sweeping epistemological metaphor to explain why having a name for this matters to human beings at all.
And this is the part about the rope, right?
Yes. It describes these 99 names, these attributes of the divine, as a rope extended from the heavens down to the earth.
A rope of knowledge. Because, I mean, without those descriptors, how do you even begin to talk about an infinite concept?
You cannot. The text argues that without these highly descriptive attributes, names that a human brain can actually process, like the owner, the merciful, the powerful humanity, would be forced into absolute agnosticism.
Because it's just too big to grasp.
Exactly. The absolute infinite nature of a creator is entirely unknowable to a finite human intellect. You just cannot comprehend the infinite. It literally breaks the parameters of human cognition.
It's like trying to explain the concept of a four-dimensional object to someone who has only ever lived in a two-dimensional world. We literally do not have the hardware to process that software.
So according to the source, these names are how the infinite makes itself comprehensible. It is the infinite translating itself into a finite vocabulary that human beings can grasp.
That makes a lot of sense.
The attributes are the rope we hold on to, so that our intellect can climb upward out of complete ignorance. It presents theology not merely as a set of rules to follow, but as an epistemological bridge. It is how the human mind approaches the boundary of the absolute.
Think about that for a second, just as a listener. Language is shaping our entire reality. When you call a piece of art or a person's character perfect, you are invoking an ancient linguistic code that actually means indestructibly strong.
It's hidden in plain sight.
Yeah, we throw these words around in casual conversation, but there are oceans of philosophical meaning beneath them. So if the consonants establish the raw, violent power of ownership, how does the language differentiate between the person who wields that power and the thing being owned?
This is where the text transitions from the consonants to an incredibly nuanced philosophy regarding Arabic vowels.
Okay, vowels.
It breaks down the root into 3 distinct words based entirely on the vowel sounds. You have milk, you have milk, and you have milk.
Milk, milk, milk.
Right. And the source references a philosophy attributed to Hazreti Ali, a major historical and religious figure, who suggested that vowel marks in Arabic grammar literally represent physical postures of power.
Wait, the posture of language itself tells you the status of the word.
Exactly.
I had never considered vowels carrying physical weight like that. Let's break that down, because this feels central to the entire philosophy of ownership.
That is the core of it. So first we have milk, which uses the U vowel sound, what is called a dam in Arabic.
Okay, the U sound.
According to this linguistic philosophy, the U sound represents the subject. It is the powerful one who stands upright with their head held high. It represents ultimate power, sovereignty, the state, absolute authority.
So it's active.
Yes, it is the entity that acts upon the world rather than being acted upon.
It stands tall. It's the prime mover. Then you have the second variation, which is milk, using the A vowel sound, the thetha.
Milk represents the object. In grammatical terms, this is the vowel of the one who yields, the one who lies down or submits.
Yielding power.
Right. In the context of the text, it signifies the angelic or spiritual realm, the Melekut. It represents the spiritual forces that yield entirely to the absolute will of the Creator. It possesses immense power, but it is a submitted power. It does not act on its own absolute authority.
Okay, so milk stands tall and milk yields. And then we get to the third one, which is the one that really hits home for our modern lives. Milk.
Spelled with an I vowel sound, the Kesra. Milk represents the dependent. The text describes this vowel posture as someone who has fallen to the absolute bottom and must lean on someone else to stand.
Oh, wow.
It represents property or material goods, what we collectively call wealth. The profound insight here is that property, milk, cannot exist independently. It is grammatically and philosophically impossible for property to exist without an owner. It must always lean on a possessor.
It's literally body language encoded directly into grammar. The U stands, the A yields, the I leans.
Exactly.
This is so different from how Western languages often frame ownership. I mean, in English, ownership is usually framed around an action I acquire, I have, I possess. It places the human at the center of the action.
Yes, the focus is entirely on the acquisition.
But here, the language itself is categorizing the nature of the thing. Property is inherently something that leans. So why does this linguistic breakdown matter when we're looking at our bank accounts or, the deeds to our houses?
It serves as a devastating critique of human materialism, because it implies that material property milk is inherently weak. It is dependent. It is the lowest possible posture of power.
Right.
Yet ultimate authority, milk, is absolute. The tragedy of the human condition, as the text argues, is our constant, desperate attempt to confuse the two.
We think our stuff makes us gods. We think that by piling up enough leaning things, we suddenly become the thing that stands tall.
We truly believe that accumulating a massive amount of pares, milk, cars, houses, land, capital, magically grants us milk, which is absolute power and sovereignty. We operate under the delusion that dependent, weak property can transform into ultimate authority.
It's a huge blind spot.
And the text frames this not merely as a moral failing, but as a profound philosophical and logical error. You simply cannot build a fortress of absolute security out of materials that are inherently dependent, fragile, and decaying.
Because at the end of the day, you're just piling up bricks that lean. You can have a billion leaning bricks, but the structure is still fundamentally leaning and has no internal sovereignty.
Exactly. It's an illusion.
So, since human beings are so prone to this delusion, confusing possessing stuff with having absolute power, how does the text actually redefine what ownership is? Because clearly we still interact with physical objects every day.
It redefines ownership by asking a very sharp, grounding question that forces a perspective shift. The text essentially asks, if you stand in front of a sprawling mansion and say, "This house is mine," did you actually create it?
Well, no.
Did you forge the iron in the core of a dying star? Did you synthesize the cement? Did you create the stone, the wood, or the very earth that the foundation is sitting on?
The obvious answer is no. We just rearranged the raw materials that were already here. We moved dirt from one place, heated it up, and put it in another place.
And since human beings did not create the raw materials of the universe out of nothing, the text argues that humans can never be the true Malik, the true absolute owner of anything. We are entirely incapable of creating matter. Therefore, we are merely borrowing it.
Borrowing it.
The text uses a very specific word for the human role in this dynamic: eminency. This translates to a trustee, or someone who is holding something in trust. We are trustees, not owners.
That is a massive paradigm shift. It completely changes your psychological relationship to the items on your desk right now. You aren't the owner, you are the temporary custodian.
Yeah.
And I was really struck by how the source anchors this idea historically, specifically regarding how early societies handled wealth and warfare, because there's a tangible economic consequence to this philosophy.
The historical context is vital for understanding how this philosophy scales up from the individual to an entire civilization. Before this theological framework was introduced, the text notes that warfare in that region was driven by the concept of sapul, which translates roughly to pillaging or looting. The rule was brutally simple. Whoever is strongest takes whatever they want, and they keep it exclusively for themselves.
Right.
It was the ultimate expression of confusing milk with milk. The logic was, I have the physical power to take this, therefore I am the absolute owner of it.
It's like finders keepers, but enforced with swords. The ultimate unregulated free market of violence.
Exactly. But the Quranic framework, as outlined in the text, forced a radical historical shift away from that. It introduced the concept of ghanimit.
Which means?
While often translated simply as war spoils, the text emphasizes that ghanimit redefined this wealth entirely. It was no longer private loot for the strongest warrior. It was suddenly classified as public wealth.
Oh, wow. So it belonged to everyone.
It was mandated that a significant portion of this wealth had to be shared with the poor, with debtors, and used to support public servants and the broader infrastructure.
The logic flows perfectly from the linguistic premise. If the wealth ultimately belongs to the absolute creator, and you are just an eminency, a trustee, then you have to distribute that wealth according to the rules of the trust, not the whims of your own greed.
You don't have the authority to hoard it.
You literally don't own it.
And the text includes a stark sociological warning regarding this hoarding. It states that if wealth is allowed to become a state, meaning a closed loop of power that only circulates among the already wealthy society, rots from the inside out.
A closed loop.
When the rich only trade with the rich and hoard the milk, they create a false milk, a false sovereignty. This chokes off the economic lifeblood of the community and ultimately collapses the social fabric. It is a warning about wealth inequality framed as a spiritual and structural inevitable failure.
And the source has this incredibly vivid, almost microscopic metaphor to describe just how devastating human hoarding would get if we were actually given absolute ownership. It's the detail about the date seed.
Oh, it is one of the most striking images in the entire lecture because it highlights the sheer absurdity of human stinginess.
Right. The text argues that if humans were actually granted the status of absolute owner of the world, like if the creator stepped back and said, okay, it's truly yours, you hold the ultimate deed, humans are so inherently greedy that they wouldn't share even a zernick, a tiny speck, with anyone else. And to illustrate this, the speaker uses two incredibly specific ancient Arabic words related to the anatomy of a date seed: nakir and fitil.
The precision of those words is what makes the metaphor work so well. Nakir refers to the microscopic groove on the back of a date seed, the tiny little indentation where the sprout eventually pushes out.
Like incredibly small.
And fitil is the nearly invisible, paper-thin membrane that covers the seed.
So the text is saying, if we were the absolute owners of the universe, our greed would be so profound that we would begrudge our neighbors even the invisible membrane on a single date seed.
We would hoard down to the atomic level.
We really would. And honestly, you look at modern corporate structures fighting over microscopic patents or, billionaires arguing over pennies and tax loopholes, and that ancient metaphor feels entirely relevant today.
It is a terrifyingly accurate observation of human nature when it is consumed by the illusion of absolute ownership. This raises a crucial question regarding our mental health, which the text answers by explaining the psychological weight of this illusion.
Right.
The text argues that true freedom is found in equilibrium. It defines freedom in a way that completely subverts our modern consumerist understanding.
How does it define it? Because usually, we define freedom as the ability to buy whatever we want, whenever we want.
According to the source, true freedom is achieved when the world being handed to you on a silver platter and the world being entirely stripped away from you elicit the exact same emotional response.
That is incredibly difficult to even imagine. A complete flat line of emotional attachment to material gain or loss.
It is the ultimate psychological baseline. The text argues that if gaining a little bit of property, getting a promotion, buying a new car, seeing your stock portfolio go up, changes who you fundamentally are, changes how you treat people, or inflates your sense of self-worth, then you do not own that property.
The property owns you.
The property owns you. You have become a servant to the milk. Your identity is now being dictated by a leaning, fragile thing.
Wow. Pause and look around the room you're in right now. Like, look at your computer, your phone, the furniture, the clothes in your closet. Do you own those items, or do they own a piece of your mental real estate?
It's a sobering thought.
If your house flooded tomorrow and you lost everything physical, how much of your identity, your core sense of I, would wash away with it? It's a really uncomfortable mirror to look into, because for most of us, our identity is heavily subsidized by our stuff.
It is deeply uncomfortable because it forces us to confront the mechanics of our own ego. What happens when we fail this test of ownership? What happens when we succumb to the greed of the date seed?
Which we do all the time.
Exactly. And the text analyzes this exact failure through the lens of ego, distinguishing very carefully between El-Mâlik, which translates to toxic selfishness, and El-Melik, which is healthy self-awareness.
Because the text makes it clear that having a sense of self isn't inherently evil, right? It's not advocating for complete ego death where you become an unthinking blob.
Not at all.
You need an I. If you can't say I, you can't bear witness to anything, you can't take responsibility for your actions, you can't pray, and you certainly can't build a functioning civilization. You need self-awareness to recognize your own existence within the universe.
Yes. El-Mâlik, self-awareness, is the prerequisite for human agency, is what allows you to recognize the other. If I know that I exist as an individual, I can recognize that you exist as an individual, and we can form an ethical relationship. We can form a community.
Right.
But the text warns that there is a razor-thin boundary between that healthy self-awareness and El-Mâlik, the toxic selfishness that seeks to elevate the self by destroying or consuming the other.
And to really map out the anatomy of this toxic selfishness, the text breaks it down into 3 distinct historical and mythological archetypes.
Yes, the 3 egos.
It categorizes them by 3 specific words of ego used in the ancient texts. And these ancient archetypes map so flawlessly onto modern personalities, it's honestly uncanny. Let's dig into the first one.
The first archetype is Satan, defined by the Arabic word een, which translates to I, in the specific context of I am better.
So the ego of superiority, I am inherently more valuable than you.
Exactly. The text analyzes the mythology of Satan's fall and points out something deeply profound. His arrogance was rooted in a very primitive, literal materialism.
Materialism? How so?
Well, according to the theological tradition, Satan refused to bow to Adam because he claimed inherent superiority based on his raw materials. He stated, I am made of fire and he is made of earth.
Oh, wow. I never thought of it that way.
It is an ego based entirely on element, on physical origin. It is a reduction of worth to basic material components.
As a quick side note, the text points out something fascinating here about Adam. It notes that Adam wasn't just literally made of dry clay in some magical pottery wheel scenario, which is how the myth is often visualized.
Right, that's a common misconception.
It notes that Adam was made from a drop of fluid, just like all of us, which debunks some of the overly literal interpretations and ties it back to a shared biological human reality. But focusing on Satan's argument, his ego is the foundation of racism, of classism, of looking at someone's physical makeup, their zip code, or their genetic background and saying, my raw material is superior to yours, therefore, Ian, I am better.
It is the ego of inherent, unearned supremacy. It assumes that the material you are made of grants you sovereign status. And that leads us to the second archetype, which shifts from material superiority to political and economic monopolization.
Okay, the second one.
This is the pharaoh, defined by the word li, which translates to it is mine or for me.
The ego of absolute hoarding.
Pharaoh represents the hoarding of the state, of authority, and of physical power. He looked at the vast kingdom of Egypt, the Nile River, the people, the agricultural resources, and declared, li, this is exclusively mine.
Just claiming the whole thing.
It is the delusion of absolute sovereignty enacted on a geopolitical scale. The pharaoh takes the concept of Mulk, which we establish belongs only to the absolute, infinite creator, and applies it to himself. It is the dictatorial ego, the belief that one finite man can literally own a nation and its people.
Which brings us to the third archetype, and honestly, this one feels the most ubiquitous in our current culture. The third archetype is Karun, or Korah, as he is known in the biblical tradition.
Right.
His defining word is indi, which translates to by my own knowledge, or from myself.
Karun represents the ultimate fatal delusion of the self-made man. According to the text, he possessed immense, incomprehensible wealth. The mythological imagery states that his treasures were so vast that just the keys to his vaults were too heavy for a man to lift. They had to be carried by caravans of strong camels.
Just the keys. That's absurd.
But his fatal flaw, the reason he serves as a cautionary tale, wasn't the mere possession of the wealth. It was the narrative he constructed about how he acquired it.
Right, because when people ask Karun about his immense fortune, he didn't express gratitude. He basically said, I got all this because I am a genius. I used my own intellect, my own hustle, my own grind to build this empire.
He completely erased any divine, communal, or systemic factors that allowed his success to happen. He claimed sole authorship of his wealth. He represents the total eradication of gratitude and the rejection of the eminency concept. By claiming Indi, by my own knowledge, he denies that he is a trustee.
He takes all the credit.
He denies that the raw materials he traded, his own baseline intelligence, the societal infrastructure that allowed him to conduct commerce, were all provisions given to him. He claims he generated his success in an absolute vacuum purely through the force of his own will.
I hear the archetype of Karun, and I instantly picture like the modern tech billionaire or the self-proclaimed hustle culture guru on a podcast talking about how they wake up at 4 a.m. and take ice baths, and that's the sole reason they are a billionaire.
The parallels are striking.
They sound identical to Karun. They act as if they didn't rely on roads built by tax dollars, the internet developed by government research, underpaid labor, lucky market timing, or just the basic genetic lottery of being born healthy and intelligent. It is the ultimate hubris of meritocracy taken to a toxic extreme.
It really is.
So how does this framework suggest we actually combat these three massive egos? How do we fight the in of superiority, the lie of hoarding, and the indi of the self-made delusion?
The text suggests that the only effective countermeasure is a radical shift in perspective regarding the nature of provision. You must recognize that you are being tested by what you are given.
Tested by what you're given.
The source makes a deeply countercultural point here. God's distribution of wealth is not random, and while it is tied to human effort, you are of course expected to work ultimately. Whatever you receive is a test of your character, not a reward for your inherent superiority.
It's a test, not a trophy. The universe isn't giving you $1 million because you are morally better than the person who has $10.
Exactly. The text completely dismantles our basic moral assumptions about wealth and poverty. It points out that giving a person what they want is not always inherently good, and withholding what they want is not always inherently bad.
Right.
Sometimes giving someone exactly what they desire is the precise mechanism that destroys them. In fact, the text describes the state of getting everything you want, having every material desire immediately fulfilled, as the ultimate curse.
Because if you get everything you want, your ego balloons to the size of Pharaoh's. Your lie takes over. You lose all friction with reality, and you become a monster.
If the universe yielded to your every whim, you would never develop patience, empathy, or psychological resilience. You would become entirely consumed by the milk, the material world, and your spiritual and ethical core would atrophy. The friction of denial is what actually shapes human character.
Okay, but this sets up a really intense paradox, though.
How so?
If getting everything you want is a curse, and wealth is this massive, dangerous test of our ego that breeds Karuns and Pharaohs, how are we supposed to interact with success when we actually achieve it?
Ah, yes.
Because practically speaking, we all have to pay rent, we all want to feed our families, we all want a baseline of comfort. Is the text arguing that we should just reject the material world entirely and live in a cave?
That tension is the core of the final section of this deep dive. And the text makes a highly counterintuitive argument regarding this paradox. It states that surviving the test of wealth is actually significantly harder than surviving the test of poverty.
Wait, really? That sounds controversial on its face, because poverty feels like a pretty unbearable, immediate test of survival.
Poverty is agonizing, absolutely, but the mechanism of the test is different. The text argues that poverty forces patience upon you. You have no choice but to endure it. The limitations are external. The world is saying no to you.
You can't escape it.
But wealth tempts you constantly, every second of the day. When you have wealth, the limitations must be entirely internal.
Oh, I see.
When you have the power to buy whatever you want, to exact revenge on whoever you want, to indulge any appetite without immediate financial consequence. Choosing restraint requires a monumental, exhausting exertion of willpower. The test of wealth is an active, relentless battle against your own expanding ego.
That makes profound psychological sense. When you are broke, you can't be a tyrant because you simply can't afford it. You don't have the leverage.
Exactly.
When you are rich, you have the leverage, which means you have to actively choose not to be a tyrant every single day.
Every single day.
The source uses a stunning metaphor from the 13th century poet Rumi to illustrate this dynamic. Rumi says that the human heart is a ship, and the wealth of the world is the sea.
It is a perfect encapsulation of how we are meant to interact with material success.
Right, because if the wealth stays outside the ship, it functions as a perfect path. The sea is what allows the ship to travel, to explore new horizons, to move forward and be useful.
It's functional.
Wealth, kept external to your identity, can be a vehicle for incredible societal good. But the exact moment that water gets inside the ship sinks. If the wealth breaches the hull of your heart and floods your internal identity, if it becomes your in or your indie, you drown in it.
To demonstrate what it actually looks like to keep the water outside the ship in real life, the source provides a historical anchor. It tells the story of a figure named Abdurrahman bin Auf. His life serves as a masterclass in radical detachment and functioning as a true eminency, a trustee.
His story completely upends the modern blueprint for wealth. He shows up in the city of Medina as a refugee with absolutely nothing. Let's walk through his timeline because it grounds all this high-level philosophy into practical action.
Abdurrahman bin Auf had been a highly successful, wealthy merchant in the city of Mecca, but due to intense religious persecution, he had to flee for his life, migrating to Medina. In doing so, he had to leave absolutely all his wealth, his property, his milk behind. He arrived in Medina entirely destitute.
He went from the top of the economic ladder to zero, literally overnight.
But instead of falling into despair or demanding charity to restore his former status, he demonstrated that emotional equilibrium we discussed earlier. The leaders in Medina, recognizing his plight, offered him half of their own wealth to get him started. They offered him money, property, a shortcut back to comfort.
And he said no.
Right, he refused all of it. He asked for only two things: a piece of rope, and for someone to point him in the direction of the local market.
A piece of rope to carry goods and directions to where commerce happened. It is the ultimate bootstrap mentality, but entirely devoid of the Karun ego.
He started from absolute scratch, carrying goods on his back, trading small items, and because of his immense skill and intellect as a merchant, he quickly generated wealth again. He rebuilt a massive fortune.
But he didn't hoard it this time.
No, here is where he passed the ultimate test of wealth. He understood that ethical earning acts as a loyal companion. He ensured every transaction was clean because, as the text notes, haram, unethical, or exploitative wealth is a traitor that will eventually destroy the society from within.
And once he earned it ethically, he didn't hoard it. He saw hoarding as the societal rot we talked about earlier. He gave it all away almost as fast as he earned it. There's an incredible quote from him in the text regarding his cash flow. He famously said, "I give 10 dirhams in the morning and it returns to me as a 1,000 by evening. I will enter heaven running."
He realized he was merely a conduit. The wealth flowed into his hands, and he immediately floated out to the community, to the poor, to the public good, treating it as ganimet rather than personal loot.
Public wealth.
Right. He was grateful when he gained it, and he praised the absolute owner when he gave it away or lost it. He did not let the water inside the ship. He lived the principle of viewing wealth always as a trust, never as a possession.
He was completely detached.
He was so detached from the hoarding of wealth that historical accounts say when he eventually died, his gold had to literally be chopped with axes in order to be distributed. There was an immense volume of it, and yet it held zero space in his heart.
Let me push back on the imagery of chopping gold with axes just for a second, because it raises a critical point. The text is very clearly not saying that wealth itself is inherently evil. It is not demanding that everyone take a vow of absolute poverty and live with just a piece of rope.
That is a crucial distinction. The text explicitly states that poverty is not something to be glorified or sought after. It actually quotes a tradition saying, Poverty is almost synonymous with disbelief or ingratitude.
Really?
Extreme poverty is recognized as a devastating force that can destroy a person's faith, their dignity, and their ability to function in society. The goal of this philosophy is not to be completely broke and destitute.
The goal is to be empty-hearted toward the wealth you possess in your hands. You can hold $1 million or $1 billion in your hand as long as there is not a single cent of it anchored in your heart. You must remain a trustee. You have to embody that final principle: own the wealth, don't belong to it.
Own the wealth, don't belong to it. It requires a constant active vigilance against the ego, recognizing that everything you hold is a temporary trust from the absolute owner.
That is a profound framework for evaluating our own lives, our careers, and the low-level anxiety that haunts our consumer culture. We have covered an immense amount of ground today.
We really have.
We started by dissecting the muscular, violent Arabic root of the word power and how true perfection requires indestructible strength. We looked at the physical posture of vowels, how absolute power stands tall while human property leans and depends.
The milk and the mo.
Right. We examined the microscopic greed of the human condition through the metaphor of the date seed and analyzed the 3 historical archetypes of toxic ego: the material superiority of Satan, the political hoarding of Pharaoh, and the self-made delusion of Karun.
The een, li, and indi.
And finally, we navigated the terrifying ocean of wealth, learning from Rumi and Abdurrahman bin Auf that the only way to survive the test of success is to keep the water entirely outside of your ship.
It challenges us to look at the material world not as an end goal, but as an active, ongoing test of our character and our capacity for detachment.
Think about what we discussed regarding true freedom, achieving that state where you feel the exact same way when the world is handed to you and when it is taken away. As you go back to your day, look around at your job, your house, your things, and ask yourself this: what is the one thing in your life right now that if you lost it tomorrow would completely shatter your sense of I? Is it your job title, your bank account, a specific piece of property? Because this is ancient linguistic philosophy holds true, it is entirely possible that the very thing you are most terrified of losing is the exact thing that is currently holding you hostage. Think about what water is currently leaking into your ship. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.
Yeah, absolutely. And to jump right in, I think the profound spiritual takeaways of the material risk being overshadowed by the densely technical linguistic analysis placed at the very beginning of the text.
Right. Well, I do want to push back on that just a little bit, right out of the gate, because to understand the burden of ownership, the material first asks the reader to really understand the language of ownership. I mean, sure, the linguistic archaeology is fascinating.
It really is. It dives deeply into the Arabic MLK root, milk. And the text gets into this incredibly granular grammatical philosophy of vowels.
Right, the whole breakdown of the phonetic power dynamics.
Exactly. Like, it explains how the Dhamma vowel, that oo sound, in milk represents the powerful upright subject or ruler.
Yeah.
And then the feta's the yielding object in milk, and the kesra is this dependency in milk. And then it spends a ton of time dissecting the muzafum ileh,
which is the Arabic genitive construction for strict possession. Yeah.
Right. So while the linguistic breakdown is fascinating, it feels a bit like making someone study the chemical composition of water when they're dying of thirst. Should the emotional core of the argument come before the technical breakdown?
Yes, 100%. Because the weakness here is that spending extensive time up front on grammatical philosophy, like the difference between muzafun ilayh and active partisans, it just delays the universal emotional core of the argument.
You're dissing people before they even get to the point about stewardship versus ownership.
Exactly. You risk losing readers who just, lack a deep academic interest in etymology. You are asking them to translate syntax before giving them a reason to care.
So how do we fix that pacing? Because we don't want to just strip away the academic rigor, right?
No, not at all. The suggestion is to simply restructure the opening to lead with a compelling, universal human problem or a striking metaphor that immediately hooks the reader.
Oh, okay.
And then, weave those linguistic insights in as supporting evidence later in the text.
Do we have a concrete example of a metaphor already in the text that we could use for that?
We do. Yeah. There's that striking analogy of the ship and the sea mentioned way later in the text.
Oh, right. The one where wealth is the water and the heart is the ship.
That's the one. And if the water gets inside, the ship sinks. So strat the piece with that. Establish a life or death scenario immediately.
That makes a lot of sense. So once the reader is hooked by this imagery of surviving the sea of wealth, then what?
Then you introduce the MLK root analysis as the essential tool for keeping the water out of the ship.
Oh, wow. So you present the grammar not as a textbook lesson, but as the actual survival tool.
Exactly. You tell them the reason your ship is taking on water is because you're confusing the realm of the ultimate ruler with your own dependent property.
Austin.
Right, it gives the grammar absolute utility.
Okay, well, building directly on that idea of navigating the sea of wealth, the material eventually applies this personal philosophy to global waters. It pivots from individual stewardship to macroeconomics.
Right, the section contrasting capitalism with Islam.
Exactly. It contrasts capitalism's view of universal hunger with Islam's view of universal provision. And it uses the Haiti earthquake as a primary example of this failure in wealth distribution.
The compelling moral pivot from ancient archetypes to modern crises currently lacks the socioeconomic nuance necessary to fully persuade a skeptical, modern audience.
Okay, but let me play devil's advocate for a second. The material makes a strong case for its theological points by highlighting these historical and global inequities.
It does, yes.
However, I wonder if a skeptical reader might say, wait, the Haiti earthquake aftermath wasn't just about a lack of sharing. It was a complex infrastructural and logistical collapse.
They absolutely would say that.
So how do we fortify the argument against that kind of resistance without writing a white paper on disaster economics?
Well, the core weakness is that leaping directly from spiritual principles to a critique of global capitalism and the Haiti disaster relies on broad generalizations.
Right, it feels a bit disconnected from reality.
Exactly. It misses a crucial opportunity to address structural counterarguments, making the whole argument seem slightly reductive.
So what is the suggestion to fix that? How do we keep the spiritual focus while acknowledging reality?
You bolster the bridge between individual spiritual stewardship and macroeconomics by briefly anticipating and addressing counterarguments regarding modern logistical or structural failures before applying the theological lens.
Ah, like steel-manning the opposing argument.
Yes, exactly. So, for a concrete example, before mentioning Haiti or the nature of capitalism, add a brief acknowledgement that while modern poverty involves massive logistical and infrastructural failures, these systemic issues are ultimately rooted in a philosophical failure.
Okay, so you can see the logistics. The ports were destroyed, the roads were bad.
Right, but then you frame the Haiti example not just as people didn't share, but as a systemic failure driven by the hoarding mindset of global powers.
Oh, I see. You tie it back to prioritizing absolute ownership over communal trust.
Exactly. You contrast that hoarding mindset, or mulkiyet, with communal trust, emanet.
That is so sharp. It transforms the argument from like a naive wish that everyone would just share into a really robust critique of systemic reality.
Yeah, and the skeptical reader can't just write it off because you've already acknowledged their logistical concerns.
I love that. So, moving on, this connects the global hoarding mindset right back to the individual psyche. The material brilliantly illustrates this through three archetypes of arrogance.
Right, Satan, Pharaoh, and Karun.
Yes, and the breakdown of their specific types of selfishness is fascinating. We have Satan's NA, which is the I am better mindset.
That biological, inherent arrogance, yeah.
And then Pharaoh's Leem, meaning it is mine, this absolute territorial ownership. And finally, Karun's Indi, the delusion of I earned it by my own knowledge.
It's an incredible diagnostic tool for the human ego.
Okay, so what I really like about this part is how vivid these psychological profiles are. But at the very end of the text, the author lists 5 practical rights of wealth.
Things like earning halal, sharing, being grateful.
Right. Is there a missed opportunity here to mathematically connect the disease to the cure? Because right now they feel a bit separated.
Yes. The archetypal trinity of Satan, Pharaoh, and Karun offers a brilliant psychological framework that currently remains disconnected from the practical solutions offered at the end of the text.
It feels like going to the doctor, getting a super detailed diagnosis, and then just being handed a generic multivitamin.
That's a perfect way to put it. The weakness is that the material introduces these three powerful symbols of arrogance to diagnose the human condition, but leaves them completely isolated when prescribing the treatment.
So the ending just feels like a standard checklist.
Exactly. It makes the final list of the 5 rights of wealth feel generic, rather than the climax of the piece's unique philosophy.
So the suggestion here would be to, what, basically map them to each other?
Yes. Intertwine the cure explicitly with the disease by matching the practical steps at the end of the text to the specific archetypal flaws they remedy, creating a deeply satisfying rhetorical loop.
So how does that map out practically? Give me some concrete examples of those connections.
Well, for example, explicitly state that practicing zakat, the act of sharing, directly neutralizes Pharaoh's lie.
Oh, wow. Because Pharaoh's whole delusion was the belief that it is solely mine.
Right. Zakat is the direct antivenom to that hoarding mindset.
I see. And then you could show how earning halal combats Qarun's envy.
Exactly. Because Qarun's delusion was that success comes solely from one's own merit. Earning halal requires acknowledging external boundaries and ethics.
It shatters that delusion of solitary merit. That is so cohesive.
And you frame the final practical steps, not just as rules, but as the specific antidotes to the inne, lin, and indi psychological viruses introduced earlier.
It makes the ending feel so much more urgent. You're handing the reader the exact medicine for the ailments you just warned them about.
Yeah, it elevates the entire journey of the text. It just makes it undeniable.
Well, we have covered some really crucial ground today. We looked at restructuring the opening to lead with the emotional ship and sea metaphor rather than the dense grammar.
Hooking the reader's heart before asking their brain to work.
Right. And then we talked about adding structural nuance to the modern socio-economic examples, like Haiti.
Anticipating those counter-arguments?
Exactly. And finally, tightly weaving the brilliant archetypes of Satan, Pharaoh, and Qarun into the final practical solutions.
Yeah, mapping the cures to the diseases. I mean, this piece is incredibly strong in its linguistic and spiritual depth.
It really is.
And by just rearranging the flow to prioritize the universal human experience, anticipating modern counterarguments, and tying the ending back to its best metaphors, the text will become an undeniably robust framework for the reader.
Absolutely. We warmly invite the listener to implement these high-level editorial shifts and submit their revised work back in for another round of feedback in a future critique.
Welcome to the debate. So, I want you to imagine you're holding the deed to your house. You look at the foundation, the concrete, the property line, and you say with complete certainty, "This is mine."
Right, it's a comforting thought.
Exactly, it's absolute. It is deeply comforting. But what if that very certainty is actually the root of systemic human inequality? Today, we are looking at a text that completely dismantles the idea of human ownership. We're examining a pretty profound lecture on the concept of El-Mâlik, the absolute owner, or the king.
Yeah, and we'll be drawing strictly from our provided source material today, which explores the really massive implications of this idea of divine ownership on, how we humans actually behave.
Right. And the central disagreement we are exploring is this. Does this source material primarily serve as a blueprint for socioeconomic restructuring, like solving systemic inequality by redefining property as just a trust and it? Or is its ultimate value found in its psychological framework, resolving that internal human struggle between healthy self-awareness and destructive ego?
I argue that the text's most vital contribution is its radical socioeconomic critique of human ownership.
And I contend that the text is fundamentally a spiritual and, a psychological guide to mastering the human ego. Any socioeconomic impacts that occur are really just downstream symptoms of fixing this deeper internal architecture.
Well, when I look at the foundation of this material, the undeniable core thesis is social and economic. I mean, the text drops what is essentially a master key for human conflict. It argues that if we just shift our perspective from "I own this" to "I am just managing this on lease," the whole system changes.
It's a massive paradigm shift, for sure.
It is. It calls this the golden formula, right? Wealth and power are not absolute ownership. They are a trust. The Arabic term it uses is amanet, and the material traces historical and modern atrocities directly back to the delusion of absolute human ownership, which it calls milkiyat. It draws a straight line from the very first human conflict, Cain murdering Abel, right up to modern tragedies. It explicitly points to the Haiti earthquake, where, hundreds of thousands died in poverty right on the doorstep of extreme wealth. And it blames this directly on the hoarding mentality created by mulkiyat. The argument is that unless we systemically dismantle the legal and economic illusion that we quote-unquote own the Earth's resources, human beings will just keep exploiting one another. It's a sophisticated blueprint for resource distribution.
I mean, the socioeconomic implications you are highlighting they're certainly present, but I see them as symptoms of a much deeper psychological focus. The text is actually this intricate exploration of the internal architecture of the human mind. It focuses on the razor-thin line between necessary self-awareness, what the text calls ben iraki, and toxic selfishness, ben chilik.
Right, that distinction is definitely in there.
Yeah, and the author emphasizes that the very linguistic root of El-Mâlik, those letters MLK, signifies strength and force, but it is not pointing toward exerting physical force over property or over other people. It's pointing toward gaining sovereignty over one's own internal landscape. Our desires, our anger, our ego, which is important, sure, but it's foundational. Without healthy self-awareness, we can't even make a conscious choice to be grateful or to recognize another human being. Without the I, we cannot recognize the you. The text is essentially telling us that you cannot fix the economy until you fix the human soul. Redistributing physical wealth is totally meaningless if the ego remains a tyrant.
I completely understand why you see the internal work as foundational, but the way the text actually deconstructs human ownership relies on undeniable physical reality. It asks an incredibly grounded material question. How can a person claim to own a house if they didn't create the iron, the cement, or the land it sits on?
Well, they bought the materials, right?
But they didn't create them, because we humans do not synthesize the raw materials of the universe. We don't make the carbon. We don't make the water. Our claim to absolute ownership is not just spiritually flawed. It is factually incorrect. And it's socially destructive. Think of it like a tenant claiming to own the entire apartment building just because they happen to hold a key to one door.
It's an absurdity.
Exactly. A legal and physical absurdity. When we claim to be the Malik, the absolute owner of something we merely borrowed, that delusion inevitably leads to exploiting the other tenants in the building. By claiming absolute ownership, the text insists we are actually committing a form of societal theft.
That physical deconstruction of the cement and the iron it's a powerful reality check, yes. But notice how quickly the text elevates that concept into an extended fascination with Arabic grammatical philosophy, or nahiv. This is where the true depth lies. It doesn't stay in the realm of building materials.
It definitely takes a turn there.
Right, it looks at how the very vowels in the Arabic language dictate power dynamics. It examines the three verbal nouns derived from the MLK root, milk, milk, and milk. And it analyzes their grammatical vowel markings. The dhamma, which is the nominative case marker, represents the subject, the powerful one holding its head high.
Okay, wait, let me make sure I'm visualizing this right, because this gets a bit abstract. You're saying the actual physical shape and sound of the vowels dictate a psychological power dynamic?
Yes, precisely.
Sort of like the difference between active and passive voice in English, but applied to human arrogance.
Exactly that. The grammatical rules are a mirror for spiritual reality. It talks about the feta, the accusative case, which represents the object laying flat and submissive, and the kesra, the genitive case, is completely dependent, dropping to the bottom. The lesson isn't about the physical building materials of a house. It's teaching us that human beings are not the dhamma.
We aren't the subject.
Right. We are not the ultimate subject of the universe, holding our heads high in absolute power. We are the feta, the object. We are the dependent variable in a divine grammar. Recognizing that you are the object of a higher power, rather than the undisputed subject of your own universe, is a deeply internal, psychological reorientation. It's a shift in how you perceive your own existence, not just an economic policy.
Okay, the grammatical metaphor is beautifully poetic. I see the value in saying ourselves as the grammatical object to a divine subject. But, poetry doesn't stop wars over resources.
I wouldn't call it just poetry.
But the text doesn't stay in the realm of vowels for long. It immediately attacks macroeconomic structures. Look at how it tackles the rules of war spoils, contrasting the regulated concept of ganimet with unregulated pillaging or chapu. In the pre-Quranic era, warfare had absolutely no limits because of this logic of absolute ownership.
That's true, it was completely unchecked.
Unchecked, right? If you conquered a city, the wealth, the people, the land, it was all yours to hoard. The text explains that the new framework regulated these spoils specifically to keep wealth as a public good. It had to be distributed to the poor, the indebted, and the public treasury. And the text gives us the explicit why: to prevent wealth from circulating only among the wealthy and becoming an oppressive, tyrannical force.
Which is a valid historical point, but
it goes further. It directly blames the obsession with mulkia for the blood spilled by competing ideologies like capitalism, communism, and liberalism. It's explicitly diagnosing the structural failures of human economies.
The problem I have with framing this purely as an economic diagnosis is that it skips over the root pathology. If this were just about economics, the text wouldn't spend so much time defining the three specific archetypes of human corruption. And it's incredibly telling that the very first archetype has absolutely nothing to do with money.
You're talking about Satan, Pharaoh, and Karun.
Yes, the text identifies three models of selfishness. Satan said, Ene, meaning I am better. Pharaoh said, Liamud, meaning Egypt belongs to me, which is, geographical and political arrogance. And Karun said, Indi, claiming he earned his vast wealth solely through his own knowledge.
But let's pause on Karun for a second. Doesn't he explicitly represent the hoarding of wealth? The text literally mentions that his wealth was so vast, the keys to his treasures had to be carried by a fleet of camels. That is a very direct critique of hyperwealth.
He does represent wealth, but look at the sequence. Satan comes first, setting the template for the other two. And Satan's original sin had zero economic value. He didn't hoard gold, he hoarded his own ego. He looked at Adam and could only see raw material. Clay versus fire.
So you're saying the materialism started as a psychological flaw?
Exactly. The text points out that this is a primitive, cheap materialism. Satan judged value based purely on physical makeup, which is the exact psychological root of racism, classism, and eventually economic hoarding. The root of the corruption isn't economics. It's a spiritual disease of Ine, the I. Furthermore, the text explicitly warns that today, things far beyond money have been corrupted into property.
Right, it mentions art and knowledge.
Yeah, it says art has been turned into property, sound has been turned into property, knowledge has become a monopoly. When the text says humanity itself has been turned into property, it is pointing to a profound psychological crisis where the ego just consumes everything it touches. The economic inequality of Karun is just the most visible symptom of a soul that has succumbed to the disease of Ene.
I mean, I see the progression you're mapping out, from the ego of Satan to the wealth of Karun. But if we look at how the text defines the ultimate victory over this corruption, it uses a profoundly literal economic mechanism. It brings up the historical figure of Abdurrahman bin Auf.
Ah, yes.
Here is a man who arrived in Medina as a refugee with absolutely nothing. He left all his wealth behind in Mecca. When a fellow believer offered him half his property, he declined. He just asked for a rope and the way to the local market. And through pure commerce, he became vastly wealthy. But here's the critical mechanism. The text notes that when he gave 10 dirhams to charity in the morning, it returned to him as 1,000 dirhams by the evening.
His wealth just kept multiplying.
Right, and his response was essentially, "It's not my fault God keeps multiplying it, I will enter heaven running." When he died, his gold had to be chopped with axes to be distributed.
But wait, doesn't that just prove his internal detachment? It wasn't about the gold for him.
It proves that internal detachment is an economic engine. The text isn't just saying he gave away money. It's showing us the mechanics of the emane of the trust. Because he truly believed he was just a manager of God's capital, he had zero friction in letting it go.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
And because he let the capital flow to where it was needed, the economy around him thrived, which in turn brought wealth back to him. The internal detachment is the exact engine that drove external economic prosperity. I argue this proves the ultimate test of understanding El-Mâlik is the literal physical management of resources. It's about how you handle the capital. If your internal state doesn't manifest in radical economic generosity, it's pretty much meaningless.
I agree that his generosity is a beautiful manifestation of the ideal, but the engine, as you call it, is entirely internal. The text explicitly defines true freedom as a state of internal equilibrium. It says, when they give you the world and take it away, and it is equal to you, you are free. That is a psychological baseline.
It's a high bar, to be sure.
It is. The text further applies this concept of mastering the MLK route to the physical body through fasting, or insak. It describes sitting at the iftar table, with a massive feast right in front of you. You are hungry, you are thirsty, but you hold back your hand until the call to prayer. That holding back, that imsak, is sovereignty over the self.
Sure, but fasting is a temporary physical action. It's a few hours of the day.
It's a temporary physical action, training a permanent psychological reality. It is teaching you how not to be consumed by your own appetites. The text uses the story of Joseph and Zuleika to perfectly illustrate this. Joseph was locked in a prison, yet the text says he was the true king because he maintained sovereignty over his lust, while Zuleika was in the palace.
Right.
She was surrounded by absolute wealth and power, yet she was a slave because she belonged entirely to her desires. The central thesis the text is driving at is nefse malak, owning oneself. If you do not own your anger, if you do not own your lust, if you do not own your ego, you cannot possibly be trusted to manage the physical wealth of the world. The internal mastery has to precede the external management.
Okay, that is a really compelling way to frame the story of Joseph. I concede that internal discipline is the prerequisite, but we have to look at the ultimate consequence if that discipline fails. The text doesn't just say a person becomes sad or spiritually empty. It says they become a tyrant.
They do.
It points out that if God had made human beings the true absolute owners of the world's wealth, we would not give each other a single speck. The text uses the phrase, they wouldn't give a zernik. We would become pharaohs. We would become Nimrods. We would become literally demonic. Every tyrant in history who has been a plague on humanity started by thinking they were the absolute owner of their power.
Which goes back to the ego.
Right. But there's a fascinating historical anecdote in the material about the Ottoman sultans. They would literally pay someone to walk through the crowds during processions and shout at the sultan, "Do not be proud, my sultan. God is greater than you."
Yes, exactly. And why did they do that? To manage the ego.
To manage the ego, yes, but for a distinctly political purpose. They didn't do it just so the sultan felt humble in his heart. They did it to prevent the state from becoming an instrument of pure oppression. The text also mentions Caliph Omar, who ruled the largest empire of his time. A commoner on the street carrying a heavy load tells him, "Fear God, Omar."
And he collapses, right?
His knees buckle. He collapses to the ground, weeping, saying, "Who is Omar not to fear God?" The text emphasizes this to show that the realization of El-Mâlik, knowing that you are merely a trustee, is the only thing that restrains political and economic power from turning into a bloodbath. The focus is always on the external impact. It's about ensuring that the garbage cans of the wealthy aren't full of wasted food while someone else starves. The text makes it a matter of faith, saying that every wasted morsel of food is a violation of this trust. That is a radically social critique.
It is a profound social critique, but one that is entirely predicated on internal mechanisms.
Let's look at how the text explains the origin of human endeavor in the first place. It says that the desire to possess is actually natural, and it was given by God. It argues that without bin idraki, self-awareness, the concept of the I, a human being couldn't even bear witness to God.
We wouldn't be able to pray.
Right. We couldn't say, "Give me, my Lord." Without this innate drive, humanity wouldn't have built cities, advanced civilizations, or produced knowledge. We would be exactly like animals who lack this specific self-awareness. The crisis only occurs when ben idraki degrades into ben shelek, selfishness.
So the self-awareness is neutral until it corrupts.
Exactly. The text beautifully notes that true self-awareness actually requires the recognition of the other. You cannot have an I without a you. When you recognize the you, it becomes a we. Satan failed this exact test. He couldn't recognize Adam as a companion, so his self-awareness mutated into toxic selfishness. That mutation is the foundational mechanism of everything you are talking about. The sociology you're describing is, well, it's just applied psychology.
I appreciate how you trace the progression from I to we. It is a vital philosophical framework. But if you're listening to this right now, thinking about your mortgage, your career, or your bank account, this text is incredibly disruptive on a practical level. The most urgent actionable message remains its golden formula.
The formula of the trust.
Right. By dismantling the illusion of absolute ownership, it demands that we treat wealth, power, and the earth's resources strictly as a shared trust. It completely strips away the modern capitalist defense of, I earned this, therefore I can do whatever I want with it. The text exposes that mindset as the arrogance of Qarun. It forces us to look at the socioeconomic structures that allow hundreds of thousands to die in poverty while excess is thrown in the trash, and it demands a radical restructuring of both systemic and personal economics.
And I would summarize my position by returning to the mind. While the social impacts you describe are undeniable, the text's deepest wisdom lies in its psychological framing. It teaches that until a person achieves internal sovereignty, until they defeat the pharaoh and the Qarun within their own mind, social equity is mathematically impossible.
Because the system is made of people.
Precisely. You cannot legislate away selfishness. You can take away a greedy man's money, but if his soul is still infected with egain, with that toxic I, he will just find another way to dominate. He will monopolize knowledge, he will monopolize art, he will monopolize power. The text is calling for humanity to realize they are the fetha, the submissive object, and to find true freedom by owning their desires rather than being owned by them.
I think where we absolutely converge is on the sheer brilliance of how this source material uses the concept of an absolute owner to strip humanity of its destructive arrogance. Whether you apply it to the macroeconomy of a nation or the micropsychology of an individual, the concept forces a recognition of our deep interconnectedness and our mutual responsibility. It completely pulls the rug out from under human hubris.
We definitely agree on that. It forces you to realize that you are not the center of the universe. The complexity of balancing the external duties of a trustee with the internal demands of self-awareness is, it's profound. There are so many layers to this text regarding the delicate balance between building a thriving civilization and not being consumed by the very things we build.
There really is so much more to explore in this material. It leaves us to navigate that tension ourselves. Think back to that deed to the house we talked about at the start of the show. The concrete, the iron, the notarized stamp. You might hold the key and you might live within its walls, but after examining this text, the next time you turn that lock and say, "This is mine," you have to ask yourself, who is actually owning who?
Yeah, exactly.
This has been The Debate.
This is the brief on the Islamic concept of El-Mâlik, translating to the absolute owner. Understanding this single concept completely flips our modern, kind of toxic obsession with wealth, power, and property right on its head. First, we really need to rethink what absolute ownership actually looks like. The concept stems from an Arabic root meaning absolute strength and power. And think about this fascinating paradox. You know, when we give something away, it's just gone, right? But for the absolute owner, giving wealth to humans doesn't diminish his ownership at all, because the giver, the receiver, and the gift itself all ultimately belong to him. Second, you gotta wonder, So, if we don't actually own our stuff, why do we fight so ruthlessly for it? Well, it comes down to confusing true, absolute property with what's really just a temporary trust. We're merely temporary trustees here. When we forget this and think we're absolute owners, it breeds the exact arrogance, tyranny, and greed driving historical conflicts and societal inequality. Finally, this gives us a totally different and frankly super challenging formula for personal freedom. I want you to really question what freedom means to you right now. According to this philosophy, true freedom only happens when gaining a massive fortune and losing it all feel exactly the same to you. By viewing wealth as a temporary trust, you possess your money instead of your money possessing you. Shifting your mindset from absolute owner to temporary steward is absolutely the ultimate key to conquering your ego and finding lasting peace.
This is the brief on the Islamic concept of El-Mâlik and the philosophy of ownership. Drawing from a theological lecture by Mustafa İslamoğlu, we're exploring how shifting our view of wealth from absolute ownership to temporary stewardship can radically change our lives. First, let's look at the linguistics. The Arabic root of El-Mâlik actually centers on ultimate strength and power. Since God is the absolute owner of literally everything, we humans are never true owners. We're just temporary trustees or custodians of whatever we happen to hold. Second, we've got to watch out for the ownership illusion. Mistaking this temporary trust for permanent ownership breeds serious selfishness and conflict. Historical figures like Pharaoh and the incredibly wealthy Qarun were entirely destroyed by their arrogant belief that their riches were solely their own doing. Now, you might be wondering, if the desire to possess causes so much trouble, why were we given this drive in the first place? Well, we actually need it to build civilizations. It only becomes destructive when it morphs from healthy self-awareness into arrogant selfishness. Finally, here's the golden rule for true freedom. You're only truly free when gaining wealth and losing it feel exactly the same to you. The poet Rumi captured this perfectly. He said, "Think of the human heart as a ship, and wealth as the sea. As long as the water stays outside, it helps you sail, right? But the second that water gets inside, the ship sinks." Ultimately, recognizing that our resources are just temporary trusts rather than our permanent property is the true secret to remaining unsinkable. This is the brief on the Islamic concept of El-Mâlik. So, scholar Mustafa İslamoğlu breaks down the huge difference between true ownership and temporary stewardship, showing how flipping this mindset literally sets you free. First up, let's talk language. The Arabic root letters M, L, K basically means strength and power, forming El-Mâlik, the absolute owner. True ownership belongs solely to God, because you gotta actually create a thing to really own it. We're just trustees, holding stuff in trust. It's kind of like being a house sitter. Sure, you've got the keys for the weekend, but if you act like you built the place, you're living an illusion.
So, what happens when we start believing we're the owners? Well, second, things take a dark turn because claiming absolute ownership breeds tyranny. History's packed with folks making this mistake. Take Pharaoh, who claimed he literally owned people, or Qarun, who thought his massive wealth was entirely self-made. Look, if a bank teller treats the vault's cash as their personal stash, it's a crime, right? So aren't we doing the exact same thing spiritually when we hoard resources? If that illusion leads to tyranny, how does letting go lead to freedom? Well, finally, realizing you own nothing actually frees you from your ego and desires. Esmâu'l gives us the ultimate test for this. Your emotional state should stay exactly the same whether the whole world is handed to you or totally taken away. Think about it. If you're completely devastated when you lose a possession, did you really own it or did it actually own you? Ultimately, treating our wealth, power, and even our own bodies as temporary trusts rather than permanent possessions is the only real way to escape the tyranny of our own egos.
This is the brief on the Islamic concept of El-Mâlik and true ownership. Today, we're unpacking a fascinating lecture by Mustafa İslamoğlu that's going to totally flip your perspective on wealth and power, showing us exactly why this mindset shift is the ultimate key to our peace of mind. So, first, let's look at the true nature of ownership. You know, the name El-Mâlik actually comes from Arabic roots meaning absolute strength and power. It designates God as the only true, absolute owner of everything, simply because he's the ultimate creator. I mean, think about it. How can we humans ever really claim to truly own a house when we didn't even create the dirt, the stone, or the iron it's built from? Second, this brings us right to the illusion of human property. See, there's a massive difference between absolute property and a temporary trust. Everything we possess, money, power, even knowledge, is really just on loan to us. Claiming we own it outright? Well, that's kind of just an arrogant delusion that breeds greed. Think of your heart as a ship and wealth as the sea. If the water stays on the outside, the ship sails beautifully, right? But if that water gets inside, the ship sinks. Finally, understanding this difference is what actually leads to real freedom. True spiritual mastery means remaining emotionally steady, feeling the exact same whether you're suddenly handed a fortune or completely stripped of everything you have. By realizing you're just a steward of goods meant to be shared, you control your desires instead of letting your possessions control you. Ultimately, true freedom isn't measured by how much you possess, but by how little your possessions possess you.